The next speaker who's coming up here, I'm very, very, very excited to introduce. Not too long ago, a friend of mine got in contact with me, and he said, what do you know about this Rhonda Patrick person? I said, Rhonda Patrick? I'm not exactly sure. I haven't heard. He's like, dude, go right now, pull up the Joe Rogan podcast and download Joe Rogan's interview with Rhonda Patrick. He said she's like your mental sister. She's talking about all the stuff that you constantly talk about. And I was like, okay, well, I haven't heard of this person. So I started digging in a little bit. I pulled up the podcast and listened to it and immediately sent out a tweet to Rhonda, got in contact with her. I said, the paleo community really doesn't know about you. This is going to be your coming out party. But this community is going to embrace and love everything you have to say. So, Dr. Rhonda Patrick. Dr. Rhonda Patrick has a PhD in biomedical science and has done extensive research on aging, cancer, metabolism, and nutrition. She has published in multiple high-impact scientific journals, including Nature and Science, and is an expert on the science behind nutrition, health, and longevity. This presentation is going to knock your socks off, I guarantee it. Please welcome Rhonda Patrick.
Thank you for that fantastic introduction, Keith. I'm not sure I'm quite the expert that Keith says. The more I learn, the more I realize I don't know. But I have been doing some research for quite some time now. As Keith mentioned, I have a PhD in biomedical science, and I've done research on aging, mitochondrial metabolism, cancer, and now I'm doing research on nutrition and micronutrient deficiencies, like vitamin and mineral deficiencies, and how these deficiencies can precipitate diseases of aging, like cancer and neurodegenerative disease. So, but in addition to that, I have a platform called Found My Fitness, where I like to break down the science behind nutrition, health, and fitness to the general public in a way that you all can understand. And also in a way that's accurate, because that's really important. I think there's a lot of press, a lot of people trying to get this health and nutrition information from scientific studies, and oftentimes they're not accurate in what they glean from those studies. So today I'm going to talk to you about how what you eat in your diet, particularly micronutrients, how things like exercise and even something called hyperthermic conditioning can change the expression of your genes. And so what does gene expression mean? So we can actually measure the expression of thousands of different genes at once through something called gene microwave profiling. And genes that are expressed, they're active. They're doing what they're supposed to do. And those are typically indicated in red. And genes that are not expressed, they're not active. And so they're not doing what they're supposed to do. Even though the gene is there, it's almost as if it wasn't there. And what's really interesting about these changes in gene expression is that they're regulated by what we eat, by how much we eat, by what we don't eat, by how much exercise we get, how stressed we are, how much sleep, what time of day it is. I can go on and on. And I'll get into this epigenetic part in a little bit. But I want to highlight the importance of a particular micronutrient called vitamin D, which is actually a fat-soluble vitamin that it gets converted into a steroid hormone that regulates the expression of over 900 genes in the human body. So that's, to give you some perspective, about 1/24 of the human genome regulated by this steroid hormone, vitamin D steroid hormone. And vitamin D can turn on and turn off expression of genes. So I recently published a paper a couple of months ago in FASEP journal where I found a mechanism by which vitamin D turns on the expression of this gene that makes an enzyme called tryptophan hydroxylase. Tryptophan hydroxylase is the rate-limiting enzyme that converts tryptophan into serotonin. And serotonin regulates a wide variety of behaviors, emotional behavior, aggression, anxiety. It regulates cognitive function, learning, and memory. So the fact that vitamin D is important to make this enzyme, and this enzyme makes serotonin in your brain, shows you that vitamin D is regulating some brain functions that also impact your behavior. Not only does vitamin D regulate your brain, but it also regulates the aging process. So telomeres are tiny caps at the end of your chromosome. So every cell in your body has 46 chromosomes, and your DNA is wound up inside these chromosomes. And telomeres are these little like orange caps at the end of these chromosomes that protect your DNA from oxidative damage, from inflammation, from these things that can damage your DNA and cause mutations that are irreversible. So you can kind of think of telomeres like the tips of shoelaces, so they protect your shoelaces from fraying. And what's really interesting is that telomere length is actually a biomarker for aging. So the younger you are, the longer your telomeres are. And as you age, your telomeres get shorter. And that's because we lose about 21 structural units off of our telomeres every year. So every time the cells in your body, whether they're liver cells or pancreatic cells or immune cells, whatever cell type it is, it's as it's proliferating and dividing, it starts to lose telomeres every year until they're shorter and shorter and shorter. And eventually, there's no telomeres left. So what happens at that point is your cell goes into a crisis and it decides to die or go into a permanent state of arrest. And at this point, your cell isn't functioning anymore. So literally, as your telomeres get shorter, your life gets shorter. It's a biomarker for aging. And we know it's involved in the aging process. Some diseases that have aberrancies or abnormalities in maintaining their telomere length, such as Werner Syndrome, is an accelerated, they age at an accelerated rate. So if you look here, a woman at 15 years looks about normal, and then at 48 years, she looks like she's about 98. So telomere length does play a role in how we age. So this brings me back to vitamin D. A few studies have looked at the role of vitamin D in telomere length, and one particular study that I like is one that was done on 2,100 different twin pairs. And they measured the vitamin D levels in these twins, and what they found was that those twins with the highest levels of vitamin D, serum levels of vitamin D, had the longest telomere length. And those with the shortest had the shortest telomere length. And what they found was that the difference in that telomere length corresponded to 5 years of aging. So those twins with shorter telomeres, even though chronologically they were the same age as their sibling, their cells, the cells in their body looked like they were 5 years older, which really highlights the importance of this difference between your chronological age in years and your biological age. So the way you treat your body, what you're eating, and how much you exercise and things like this impact your biological age. So you can actually have someone who is chronologically older but biologically younger because they're getting the right micronutrients, they're doing the right things, exercising and doing things like paleo where they're lowering inflammation, not eating a lot of sugar and things like that. So the mechanism by which vitamin D regulates telomere length brings me back to the gene expression. So vitamin D increases the expression of genes that are involved in repairing damaged DNA. They're DNA repair enzymes. So it lowers DNA damage, which is one thing that can make your telomeres get shorter. The other way is that vitamin D increases the expression of anti-inflammatory genes, and it decreases the expression of pro-inflammatory genes. So vitamin D is lowering inflammation. Inflammation also can accelerate telomere shortening. So these are the two mechanisms by how vitamin D can change gene expression, and that can regulate the way you age. So just to highlight the importance of vitamin D in the aging process, these mice here are the same age. The mouse on the left here is vitamin D deficient, and the mouse on the right has normal levels of vitamin D, and they're about 4.5 months old here. Here are the same mice 4 months later. So the vitamin D deficient mouse looks pretty gnarly. I'd say that's probably an understatement. But there's tons of different multifunction, dysfunction going on where there's a variety of different genes. 900 different genes are being dysregulated, and that's affecting the way this mouse is aging. And what's really terrifying is that the most recent survey by Enhancement found that 70% of the U.S. population does not meet the requirement for adequate levels of vitamin D. 70%. So to me, that's terrifying, but why is that? So vitamin D, we can make it from the sun. We can convert something called 7-dehydrocholesterol in our skin to vitamin D3, but this depends on UVB light. So you need UVB light to interact in order to convert this cholesterol into vitamin D. But things like sunscreen and dark skin color filter out the burning rays of the sun, so they filter out UVB light, but they also prevent the body from making its own vitamin D. In addition to that, high body fat can regulate the bioavailability of vitamin D. So vitamin D is fat soluble, it's stored in fat. The more body fat you have, the less bioavailable it is to be released into the bloodstream. Vitamin D3 gets released into the bloodstream, and then if you're making it in the skin, if you're eating it orally, of course, it gets absorbed. But then it gets converted into this pre-hormone in the liver and then goes to the kidney where it gets converted into the active hormone, which regulates all these genes. So body fat can also affect the bioavailability of vitamin D. In addition to that, age. So the older you are, the less efficient your body is at making its own vitamin D from UVB light. In fact, a 70-year-old makes 1/4 less vitamin D in their skin than their former 20-year-old self. So all these things are impacting the micronutrient, the vitamin D deficiency that's very prevalent in the United States and actually even globally. Other things that can increase or change the expression of genes that affect telomere length are meditation. So meditation has been shown to increase telomere length by a different mechanism than vitamin D. And that mechanism is it increases the expression of a gene that makes an enzyme called telomerase. And telomerase is an enzyme that can actually rebuild your telomeres. The only problem is that most of the cells in our body, that gene is there, but we don't express it. Like I said, gene expression is important for genes to be active to do what they're supposed to do. So meditation can increase the expression of this gene that makes telomerase. And there's a reason why most of our cells don't express telomerase, and that is because cancer cells oftentimes will upregulate, they'll increase the expression of this gene to help make them immortal. So I think our bodies have a very tight regulation on how much of this enzyme we increase the expression of. But it does rebuild our telomeres, and meditation has been shown to increase the activity of it. Exercise has also been shown to increase telomere length. In another study that was done on 2,500 twin pairs, those twins that were the most active had the longest telomeres, and those that were the most sedentary had the shortest. And if you compared the most active to the most sedentary, there was a difference in 10 years of telomere length. So 10 years of biological aging difference in the telomeres from the people that were the most physically active compared to the ones that were the most sedentary. That's a pretty significant difference. If you ask me, if you're looking at someone that's the same age as their twin, and you look at their cells and they look 10 years biologically younger. Exercise not only regulates your telomeres, but it also makes you smarter. So this study was published a few years ago back in PNAS, and they found that exercise increases the expression of genes that make neurotrophic factors. So neurotrophic factors increase neurogenesis, which is the growth of new brain cells. And not only did these people grow new brain cells, these people exercised 4 hours a week, by the way. The study was 4 hours a week. They also had an increase in the size of their hippocampus, which is the part of your brain involved in learning and memory. So exercise not only makes you have more brain cells, but it makes your brain cells that you have smarter. So some other things that can regulate neurogenesis are dark chocolate and tea, red wine and blueberries, and also people's sex and cannabinoids, which are found in marijuana, have been shown. So, I'm just conveying the message here. So how is it that we can change the expression of our genes? Well, I'm going to introduce you to a very simplistic version of the epigenome. So as I mentioned, changes in gene expression, you can increase genes, they're active, or you can decrease the expression of genes, they're not active, even though they're there. And these certain factors called epigenetic marks, like methylation groups, acetylation groups, they sit on top of your genes, your DNA, and they'll turn genes on and they'll turn genes off. And these epigenetic marks are regulated by micronutrients, by exercise, by stress, by sleep. And what's really interesting is that these epigenetic marks not only change the expression of your own genes, but they can also be passed on through the germline, so through the eggs and the sperm cells, to your offspring, to your children, and even grandchildren, we're finding out now. So to highlight, I guess I'll give you an example, starting with mice. And so this mouse here, a little fatty, was fed a very high inflammatory diet. He was given lots of corn oil. So he became obese and got type 2 diabetes. Big surprise. We know the role of inflammation in type 2 diabetes. But what was a surprise is that he had an offspring, a female pup, that was given normal diet. So this pup wasn't given a high corn oil diet. It wasn't given a high inflammatory oil diet. But the pup ended up getting type 1 diabetes. So it wasn't able to produce insulin. And that's because the high corn oil inflammatory diet in the male, the father, epigenetically changed the expression of genes involved in the insulin production in their beta islet cells. And this was passed on through the sperm. And so this pup now, even though it didn't do anything wrong, has type 1 diabetes. So let's look at a good example. So this is a classic study that was done in Duke University, where researchers took these mice that have yellow fur. And this yellow fur, these mice are called agouti mice. And the gene that encodes for the yellow fur is the agouti gene. And while their fur is really pretty, the problem is that this yellow fur, the gene that encodes for this yellow fur, also predisposes them to obesity, to cancer, and to type 2 diabetes. So having this yellow fur in mice is a bad thing because you're more likely to get obese and get cancer earlier. And what they did was they took female mice and they fed them a diet high in B vitamins. They gave them folic acid and they also gave them B12 3 weeks before they got pregnant. And what they found was that these mice had silenced the agouti gene. They had methylated that agouti gene and was passed on to their offspring. So even though the offspring had that agouti gene, it wasn't expressed, and they no longer had the yellow fur, and they also no longer had were predisposed to type 2 diabetes, and cancer, and obesity. So that really highlights the importance of having good micronutrients in your diet, because good micronutrients are important for regulating gene expression. And actually, folic acid is a prime example. So folate actually is important for making DNA. It's important for making something called thymine, which is one of the nucleotides in your DNA, but it's also an important methyl donor. So folate's an important micronutrient to have in your body because it's very important to provide these methyl groups that, like I mentioned, sit on top of your DNA and will turn genes on or off. Mostly they turn genes off, but they also can turn them on. And just want to mention here that the enzyme that people need to get this methyl group from the folate, a lot of people have a mutation in this gene, the methyl tetrahydrofolate reductase gene. So many people have a polymorphism in that gene, and subsequently, even though they're getting enough folic acid or dietary intakes of folic acid, they actually aren't getting enough to provide these methyl groups. And what happens is when you get your homocysteine levels measured, they'll be really high. And you may be a little confused if you eat a good diet why your homocysteine levels are high. Well, the reason is because you actually need much higher doses of folic acid if you have this polymorphism. So just to highlight the complexity of humans here and individual variation, what one person requires for micronutrient intake, another person may actually require more or less of. So not only can epigenetics reverse or predispose you to diseases like type 1 diabetes, or type 2 diabetes, but can also, it's important for learning and memory. So things like learning and memory can be passed on epigenetically. So in this study, researchers took mice that were genetically engineered to get neurodegenerative disease. And they put these mice in what's called an enriched environment. They gave them these toys to exercise, to stimulate different regions of their brain, the visual region, the somatosensory region, the motor region. And what they found was that this exercise and stimulating these parts of the brain increased the expression of genes that are involved in long-term potentiation. And long-term potentiation is making connection between neurons so that these are the connections you make when you're learning something. When you're actively learning new information, which you all are doing right now, long-term potentiation is going on, and that is how you're learning it. So these mice increased the expression of those genes, and therefore they scored better on learning and memory tests, which is really cool because they're genetically engineered to get, like an Alzheimer's-like neurodegenerative disease, so they're not supposed to score well in learning and memory tests. But what was really, really interesting about this study is that these mice had offspring mice, okay? And those offspring were also genetically engineered to get neurodegenerative disease. But they weren't given exercise equipment. They weren't given this enriched environment. They were just put in a cage with some bedding and some food. but they had retained that increased gene expression of long-term potentiation genes. So they had reaped the benefits of their parents. So they also had increased long-term potentiation, and they also scored better on learning and memory tests, even though they weren't exposed to the exercise in the enriched environment. Epigenetics, people. All right, so I'm going to switch gears here, and I'm going to talk about a new fitness hack that I just recently introduced into the fitness community. I did a guest blog post on Tim Ferriss's 4-Hour Work Week a couple days ago, where I'm introducing this concept of using heat stress through something like the sauna to induce physiological adaptations that allow you to better deal with heat stress later on. So, for example, when you're exercising physical activity, you're increasing your core body temperatures increase, that's a heat stress. So this term I call is hyperthermic conditioning. And what I'm going to talk to you about is how hyperthermic conditioning your body to heat stress through the sauna can cause endurance enhancements, can help you maintain lean muscle mass, and can also have positive benefits on the brain. So let's talk about some of these endurance enhancements. So hyperthermic conditioning through using the sauna to condition your body to heat stress, to deal with heat, actually increases blood flow to your muscles later on when you're elevating your core body temperature. And what this does is that this increases nutrient take to your muscles, so you're having more esterified fatty acids, more glucose and oxygen being transported to your muscle cells, so that your muscles rely less on local glycogen stores when you're doing some sort of endurance training, and this has been shown in multiple studies. In addition, it also increases blood flow to the heart. So this improves cardiovascular mechanisms. So actually, it lowers the heart rate for the same given work strain or the same given workload that you're applying. And so it allows you to maintain exercise for longer. And it also improves thermoregulatory mechanisms. So being heat acclimated or hypothermic conditioning allows your body to start sweating at a lower core body temperature and also to maintain that sweat for a longer time period, so it actually cools your core body temperature, and it also activates the sympathetic nervous system, cooling your core body temperature. So what kind of endurance enhancements can you expect to gain from hyperthermic conditioning? Well, in one study, 30-minute sauna session twice a week for 6 weeks after their running session, these are male runners, they experienced a 32% increase in their running distance until exhaustion. And that corresponded with a 7% increase in plasma volume and a corresponding 3.5% increase in their red blood cell count, which is thought to be a compensation for the increased plasma volume. This is one study, but if you go and check out my article on the 4-Hour Workweek blog, you'll see multiple other studies that back this up and so that support this study. In addition, hyperthermic conditioning can help you maintain your lean muscle mass by 3 mechanisms. The induction of heat shock proteins, which I'll get to in a minute, and this is where the gene expression comes in, and this is also where I'm going to talk about hormesis. And also through the induction of growth hormone, and by improving insulin sensitivity. So let's start off with the heat shock proteins. So heat causes heat stress, and the response in your body to this heat stress is to increase the expression of genes that make something called heat shock proteins. And this is really a prime example of hormesis. So where you apply stress, so heat is a form of stress, exercise is also a form of stress, you're also elevating your core body temperature, so you're stressing your body. But there's a stress response. Your body responds to this stress that you're applying by increasing the expression of genes that can deal with stress. So it increases the expression of genes like antioxidant genes. In this case, when you apply heat stress, it increases the expression of genes that make heat shock proteins. And heat shock proteins are pretty awesome because they repair damaged proteins. So they help these proteins in your body are what are doing all the work. And they repair proteins that are damaged to make sure that they have their proper structure. You need your proteins to have their proper structure in order to do what they're supposed to do. And they also prevent oxidative stress. So they scavenge free radicals, and they also increase glutathione recycling. So these heat shock proteins, HSPs, are very, very important and also a really cool hormetic response to heat that can help your body deal with stress. And what's interesting is that they also, because they can repair damaged proteins and prevent oxidative stress, they prevent the degradation of proteins, because both oxidized proteins get degraded, and also proteins that are not that are damaged, that are not in their proper structure, they also get degraded. So what ends up happening is that heat shock proteins can cause a net increase in protein synthesis, which, if we're looking in a muscle cell, is kind of important. If you're trying to maintain muscle mass or even gain muscle mass, you obviously need to apply a workforce or apply a workload during whatever sort of physical activity that is, and also you need to have a protein synthesis, a net protein synthesis gain, which is also important. So when you hyperthermically condition your body to heat stress through the sauna, what ends up happening is that under normal temperatures, so when you're done with the sauna under normal temperatures, you actually have a higher expression of these genes and these heat shock proteins just under normal temperatures. And then what happens is later on, when you increase your core body temperature, when you're exercising, you have an even higher level of these heat shock proteins. So let's talk about what this means functionally. So in mice that were subjected to 30-minute, I guess kind of a sauna session for mouse, they put them in a little chamber. It's called whole body hyperthermia for 30 minutes. And they did this every other day for a week. And what they found is that when they made these mice, they immobilized them. They put a little cast on their little hind legs so they couldn't move for a week. And then they took the cast off and let them move around again. So they were then, this reintroduction to exercise usually causes a big burst in oxidative stress. But what they found is that these mice actually had a 30% increase in the regrowth in their soleus muscle, and that corresponded with an increase in HSP70, heat shock protein 70. So and this was compared to the mice that were not hypothermically conditioned. So these mice that were hyperthermically conditioned, high expression of HSP70, the other ones didn't, and they also regrew 30% more of their soleus muscle. Hyperthermic conditioning can also inhibit muscle atrophy through a similar mechanism. So in one study that was very similar to one I just talked about, they hyperthermically conditioned these mice, and then they immobilized them for a week, and they found that the ones that were hyperthermically conditioned lost 32% less of their muscle. So, and that's because hyperthermic conditioning increases the expression of HSP70. HSP70 can prevent oxidative stress on those proteins. It can also decrease inflammation because it decreases the expression of NF-kappa B, or inhibits the activity of NF-kappa B, which is known to play a role in accelerating muscle atrophy. And that's how you're able to maintain your muscle mass. So, just an aside here, I thought was kind of cool, is that HSP32, a specific heat shock protein, also known as heme oxygenase 1, has been shown to protect against rhabdomyolysis. Rhabdomyolysis, for any of you guys that don't know, can occur during very, very, very extreme muscle overuse. And what happens is that your muscle tissue starts to break down, and it releases myoglobin into the bloodstream, which is then toxic to the kidneys, and then you can go into kidney failure. So HSP32 actually degrades myoglobin. So HSP32 is a heme, it catalyzes a reaction that degrades heme, which is in myoglobin. So they've shown that HSP32 in mice can protect against rhabdomyolysis because it degrades that myoglobin before it can be toxic to the kidneys. And this is very different from the role of most HSPs in preventing protein degradation, but I thought it was a really interesting point. So how does hyperthermic conditioning affect growth hormone? Well, sauna use can increase the expression of, can increase the release of growth hormone by quite a bit. So the way that growth hormone can help you maintain muscle mass is by usually mediated by IGF-1. And so IGF-1 can affect protein synthesis by increasing mTOR, and it can also decrease protein degradation by activating FOXO-genes. And so this is how increasing growth hormone can help maintain muscle mass, because it helps maintain that balance, that net protein synthesis. And so actually, if you take IGF-1 and express it in the muscle cells of mice, it causes hypertrophy. So mice that have IGF-1 here, you can see their forelimb and hind limb, they have much higher levels of muscle mass compared to just a normal wild-type mouse. That's just to highlight the role of IGF-1 in hypertrophy, basically, in the muscle. So how does the sauna affect growth hormone? Well, it all depends on the temperature of the sauna, the amount of time you're in the sauna, and the frequency that you do it. So, for example, 2 back-to-back 20-minute sauna sessions at 176 degrees Fahrenheit has been shown to increase the expression of growth hormone by 2-fold over baseline. 2 one-hour sauna sessions, this is totally extreme, separated by a 30-minute cooling period for 3 days in a row, can increase the expression of growth hormone over baseline by 16-fold. And that's something, it's very extreme. It's just to highlight that what I'm saying here is that you can hyperthermically condition your body to cause these physiological adaptations that help you, upon later heat stress, you're adapting, and there's certain cellular responses that are occurring. And so there's a few studies, if you want to take a look at the article on the 4-Hour Workweek blog that I just did a guest blog post on. So the last way that hyperthermic conditioning can affect muscle mass is by improving insulin sensitivity. So insulin is well known for its role in glucose homeostasis, but it also has a role in protein metabolism. So in skeletal muscle, when you're sensitive to insulin, so when insulin is released, you take up glucose into your muscle cells. And this can actually affect protein synthesis by activating AKT, which increases protein synthesis by mTOR and also decreases degradation by activating FOXO genes, so changing the expression of those genes. And also by increasing the uptake of amino acids into your muscle cells, so that affects protein synthesis. And it also inhibits something called the proteasome. The proteasome is this cellular complex inside your cells that's responsible for degrading a lot of proteins. So this inhibits that activity from happening. And actually, if you look at type 1 diabetics, the ones that cannot make or produce insulin, they have a very severe muscle wasting, and that's because they don't have this inhibition on the proteasome. So their proteasome keeps degrading all these proteins, and so their skeletal muscle catabolism is very high. So how does this relate to the sauna? Well, hyperthermic conditioning in a diabetic mouse model, so this obese diabetic mouse model, when you put these mice for three different sessions a week in a 30-minute session, and this is for 12 weeks. If you hyperthermically condition them 3 times a week for 12 weeks, they actually showed a 31% decrease in insulin, and that corresponded with insulin sensitivity. And what they found was that these mice increased the expression of genes called glucose transporters. Specifically, it was GLUT4 transporters in their skeletal muscle. So exposing them to this heat, this hyperthermic conditioning, changed the expression of GLUT4 transporters, increased them. And so what happened is when they produced insulin, even though they're insulin resistant, they had an increased expression of glucose transporters, and so they actually took up glucose into their muscle cells, and the cell was like, oh, I got my glucose, I don't need to keep making insulin, so it stopped making insulin, and that's why there was a 31% decrease in insulin, which is really kind of cool. And I'm hoping to see more research in this area on using something like hyperthermic conditioning or heat stress, and how that can help improve insulin sensitivity. And lastly, I'm going to just mention some of the cool effects on the brain. So hyperthermic conditioning has been shown to have very profound neuroendocrine effects and other effects on the brain. It's been shown in both men and women to increase not only the release of norepinephrine, but the storage of norepinephrine so that you can later release it. And norepinephrine helps with focus and attention. So I think that's kind of cool. It also increases prolactin. It increases in both men and women, but really profoundly seems to increase prolactin in women. And prolactin has been shown to be important for myelination. And myelination's very important for a lot of reasons. It also helps the connections between your neurons so that your brain can function faster. And lastly, it increases the expression of brain-derived neurotrophic factors, so BDNF. Which is important for neurogenesis, so growing new brain cells. And also it's important to enhance learning and memory. So these are just sort of a brief overview of some of the cool effects that hyperthermic conditioning has on your brain. And there you have it, people. So what you eat, your diet, particular micronutrients in your diet, can change the expression of your genes. How much exercise you do, if you're stressed, how stressed you are, and also even things like heat stress, hyperthermic conditioning. These can all change the expression of your genes, and changing the expression of these genes can affect both the way you age, so your longevity, but it can also affect your performance in the case of endurance enhancements. So I'd like to just quickly give a real quick call to action. If you liked what I had to say here, go sign up for my newsletter, foundmyfitness.com. I have free reports you can choose from when you sign up for my newsletter. I have one on omega-3 and also on coconut oil. Also, if you liked what I had to say today, please help me share this with the public. And the number one way you can do that is by going and reviewing my iTunes podcast, and also on Stitcher. That's probably the best way you could help me increase this message to the public, because it'll increase the likelihood that they will see what I have to say in my podcast. And lastly, I have a few milestones I'd like to achieve. I do research full time, but I also have this Found My Fitness platform where I put out podcasts and articles. And I have this Patreon where you can become a Patreon pledger and pledge $1 a month. And when I reach my milestones, I have a couple of milestones, one where I'll put out 2 podcasts a month and one where I put out 4 podcasts a month. So I'd really like to reach those milestones because it'll give me some strong motivation to do more podcasts on top of the research I'm already doing. And with that, I'll say thank you very much for listening. I hope you learned something, and I'll take questions.